Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. The video tells about the complex and contradictory lives of royal family members in the Middle Ages, focusing on famous figures such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen Matilda, King Edward III, and Queen Philippa. Alongside the glamorous and splendid images, the video also reveals the difficulties, power struggles, and the fragility and humanity beneath the crown. A day in the life of medieval royalty dreams in the castle. Today, I want to tell you about a day in the life of a medieval king, a picture both magnificent and harsh, full of rituals and expectations. This period, lasting from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the world beginning to shine more brightly during the Renaissance in the 15th century, was a long and turbulent journey, but also a glorious era for the royals. I imagine that king. He lives in a magnificent castle with tall, sturdy stone walls blocking the wind, inside covered with premium silk tapestries, luxurious brocade curtains adorned with intricate patterns, and light from flickering candles reflecting off bronze vases and exquisitely carved tables and chairs. Heavy layers of red velvet curtains obscure the royal bedchamber. That warm space is where a day full of rituals and duties begins. Morning ritual, from sleep to divine power. Each day of the king begins unlike anyone else's. Not with the sound of a clock bell or alarm, but with the whispers of attendants, trusted servants, often nobles or rigorously trained clerics. I picture the king waking up in a large, intricately carved bed covered with soft silk blankets and jasmine-scented feather pillows. He cannot leave the bed at will, but must wait for permission from the steward and priests, because the king is not only the earthly ruler, but also the earthly embodiment of divine power. Waking up becomes the first ritual, expressing respect for supernatural power and social order. Then, the king is helped to dress in royal clothes made of velvet and brocade embroidered with sparkling gold thread, symbolizing his sacred status. Each layer worn is not only to keep warm, but also to signify strength and nobility. Prayer and religious ceremony. Immediately after waking up, the king would attend a prayer ceremony at the royal chapel, a place reserved exclusively for the monarch and his closest officials. This was the moment when the king sought blessings from God, affirming that his power came not only from man, but from divine mandate. Scriptures echoed through the quiet space, mingling with the soft chime of small bells and the warm glow of candlelight. The king knelt, his head adorned with a gleaming crown, filled with reverence, eyes fixed upon the cross. This ritual was both a spiritual duty and a way to reinforce his power and legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects. Governing and managing the kingdom. After the religious ceremony ended, the official duties began. The king summoned officials, dukes, earls, and powerful figures at court to discuss matters of the realm: taxes, laws, military affairs, and political alliances. The meeting room was adorned with hand-woven tapestries and paintings depicting heroic victories. The king sat on an intricately carved throne, facing attentive or debating faces. Every decision was the result of careful balancing between family interests, factional loyalties, and the mission of defending the nation from external threats. A life of luxury bound by tradition. One might think the king's life was filled with indulgent pleasures: feasts, music, performances by artisans, luxurious garments. But in truth, it was a life bound by countless traditions and expectations. The king was not permitted to show emotions at will. He had to maintain solemnity, composure, and authority at all times, whether in joy or under pressure from political factions. Every gesture, from how he held his wine cup, how he bowed to guests, to each word spoken, was closely observed and carried political weight. Even a frown could be misinterpreted or become ammunition for opposition. Royal meals and elaborate rituals. At lunchtime or dinner, the king was served the most refined dishes of the medieval era: stewed venison, fresh fish, special breads, and fine wines. But not everyone was allowed to sit near the king. The dining arrangement followed a strict hierarchy. Those closest to the king were privileged to sit beside the throne, while less important officials were seated farther away. Meals were also occasions for officials to probe the king's opinions or exchange news. Everything took place with solemnity and caution. Rest time and private pleasures. After tense working hours, the king also had moments reserved for himself. It might be when listening to ancient songs performed by artisans or reading rare manuscripts about history and morality. He could also spend time in the royal garden, a meticulously cared for place with rows of roses and lush greenery, to meditate and relax. However, even these moments of rest were not entirely free. There was always someone following closely, reporting everything happening in the castle. Life behind the crown. Although living in luxury and power, the king was not spared loneliness and psychological pressure, because no one could truly be close to a person at the peak of power while still maintaining distance. Within the thick stone walls, genuine relationships, absolute trust were rare, and sometimes intimate secrets existed only between the king and his most trusted attendants. Night falls, silence and preparation for a new day. As the sun gradually set, the castle became quieter, candles dimmed, voices and chatter gradually faded. The king returned to the royal bedroom, removed his brocade robe, lay on the warm bed among silk blankets. Yet his mind remained busy with plans and unfinished responsibilities. Before closing his eyes, the king silently prayed to God for health, wisdom, and protection for the kingdom. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the symbol of a medieval queen and a life full of storms. After following a day in the life of a medieval king, I want to tell you about a woman of no less influence, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and renowned queens of the Middle Ages. A wealthy and powerful heiress, Eleanor was born in 1122 in Aquitaine, western France, one of the richest and most powerful regions in the Middle Ages. From childhood, she was considered the greatest heiress of this land, a position not many women of that time held. Aquitaine was not only rich in resources, but also a cultural center where artisans, poets, and scholars gathered, creating a rare and vibrant artistic atmosphere. This played a significant role in shaping Eleanor into a woman of vision, knowledge, and a deep love for culture. The first marriage and inevitable conflicts. At the age of 15, Eleanor was married to King Louis VII of France, a union seen as an important alliance of power. But few know that this marriage was far from happy. Louis VII was a devout, reserved, and somewhat weak man, while Eleanor was strong-willed, decisive, and outspoken. These differences led to frequent conflicts at court. Moreover, Eleanor was not a passive queen. She actively participated in key decisions. The peak of their disagreements came when Louis VII decided to join the Second Crusade. Instead of merely following, Eleanor led her own military contingent, a rare act for a woman in the Middle Ages. However, the crusade did not succeed as hoped, and the tensions in their marriage deepened. Eventually, their marriage ended in divorce, an extremely rare and controversial act in the feudal society of the time. A new life with Henry II, building a mighty empire. After parting ways with Louis VII, Eleanor married Henry II of England, one of the most powerful kings of the Middle Ages. This marriage not only united two individuals, but also created a vast empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. With Eleanor's position, the region of Aquitaine was merged into the English Empire, forming an enormous territory unmatched by most European nations. Mother of 8 and internal strife. Eleanor and Henry II had a total of 8 children, among whom the most notable were Richard I, known as Richard the Lionheart, a heroic king in history, and John, who later became King of England but was known for many controversies. However, Eleanor's marriage to Henry II was far from peaceful. She was a strong woman who refused to remain on the sidelines of power. For many years, she supported her sons in their rebellion against Henry II, a decision that led to her being imprisoned by her own husband for 16 long years. Here is your requested English translation with no added fillers or rephrasing. It may be hard to imagine that a powerful woman like Eleanor endured such a long imprisonment. But this is also a testament to the intense internal conflicts within the royal family during the medieval period. Regency and power after her husband's death. When Henry II died, Eleanor did not retreat into the background but continued to assume an important political role. She became regent for her son Richard when he went off to fight in the Crusades. In this role, Eleanor continued to demonstrate her leadership skills, decisiveness, and wide-reaching influence in maintaining order, managing the kingdom, and preserving the power of the dynasty. A patron of art and culture. Beyond politics, Eleanor was a major patron of medieval art and culture. She encouraged the development of plays, poetry, and music at court, contributing to the formation of the famous tradition of romantic love in medieval culture. Thanks to her influence, the royal court became a center of art and creativity, a place where poets and artists came to seek patronage and shine. A life of endurance and longevity, Eleanor lived to be 82 years old, a remarkable age by medieval standards when the average life expectancy was only around 30 to 40 years. Her life stands as proof of the resilience, strength, and intelligence of a woman amidst the upheavals and challenges of history. Despite many hardships, turbulent marriages, years of imprisonment, and family conflicts, Eleanor remained steadfast and left a profound mark on European royal history. Connecting to the broader picture of medieval royalty. Looking back at the life of Eleanor and the king in the previous M-log, we can clearly see one common thread. Royal life in the medieval era was a mixture of power, responsibility, luxury, but also pressure and internal strife. Eleanor was not just the woman behind the throne, but a warrior, a leader, a resilient mother, and a symbol of an era in which women could and did wield power in their own way. Empress Matilda, the fierce struggle of a woman on the medieval throne. If Eleanor of Aquitaine was a symbol of power and resilience in medieval royal life, then Empress Matilda was the most vivid embodiment of the arduous struggle women faced in asserting their position and authority within a harshly patriarchal society. The daughter of King Henry I, destiny and preparation. Matilda was born in 1102, the only surviving daughter of King Henry I of England. From an early age, she was groomed by her father to become his heir. This was highly unusual and unprecedented, as kingship at the time was almost exclusively passed to male successors. Her preparation involved not only education, but also the mental and practical training to become a true leader. Matilda was taught to face the political challenges, court intrigues, and power struggles of royal life. Marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. In her early 20s, Matilda was married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe at the time. This union was seen as a strategic alliance between two great empires. However, the marriage was short-lived. Henry V died young, leaving Matilda a young widow caught in the middle of complex political maneuvering. This marked a major turning point in her life, as she had to return to England to face a new destiny. A female heir rejected. After the death of her father, Henry I, Matilda was named heir to the English throne. But this was met with strong resistance from nobles and powerful factions, as medieval society deeply favored male rulers. The nobility refused to accept a woman as monarch, believing she lacked the strength to lead a kingdom. They sought every opportunity to usurp her claim, including her cousin Stephen of Blois, who swiftly seized the throne. The long civil war, the anarchy. Thus began a prolonged civil war known in history as the period of anarchy. It was a bloody conflict between Matilda's supporters and those loyal to King Stephen. Matilda refused to submit. She led armies into battle, using both strategy and cunning to reclaim her rightful power. At one point, she came close to being crowned, with recognition from royalty and nobility. Yet the brutal reality of war and intricate political schemes ultimately led to her failure to secure the throne. Mother of Henry II. Though she never became queen herself, Matilda left behind a significant legacy through her only son, Henry II. Henry II later became King of England, founding the long-lasting Plantagenet dynasty, which had profound influence on English and European history. Thanks to the foundation and education passed down by Matilda, Henry II became a great monarch who ushered in a period of prosperity and power for England, a symbol of the hardships faced by royal women. The life of Matilda is a vivid testament to the difficulties and prejudices that royal women had to confront in the male-dominated society of the Middle Ages. She not only had to fight on the battlefield, but also deal with internal resistance, overthrow plots, and even suspicion from those closest to her. Although she did not succeed in becoming the first queen regnant of England, she paved the way for more powerful women in the future and became a symbol of resilience and defiance. Connection with Eleanor of Aquitaine and the medieval royal landscape. While Eleanor of Aquitaine represents power, culture, and the resilience of medieval queens, Matilda embodies the harsh, painful struggle to preserve authority and position. These two women lived in the same era, endured many upheavals in royal life, yet both left a deep mark on European history. The story of royal women in a time of challenge. Through Matilda's life, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexity of life within the medieval royal court. Behind the splendid robes and majestic thrones were relentless battles, sacrifices, and losses. Royal women, despite their noble status, still had to face societal prejudices, strict control, and were constantly required to prove their worth through courage and intellect. The life of Empress Matilda is not just a story of a strong woman, but also a mirror for anyone striving for justice, power, and recognition. She teaches us that even when opposed and placed at a disadvantage, with enough perseverance and strategy, values and rights will eventually be acknowledged, even if not immediately. After the stories of resilient women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and the fiercely tested Empress Matilda, today I want to tell you about a royal couple who stood out not only for political power, but also for courtly elegance, kindness, and chivalric ideals: King Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. Edward III, the young king and his journey of growth. Edward III ascended to the throne of England at the age of 14, during a difficult time when the country was facing instability and the threat of war with France was growing. But despite his youth, Edward did not lack decisiveness or a sense of responsibility. Under his leadership, England entered the Hundred Years' War, one of the longest and most far-reaching conflicts in European history, shaping the fate of many generations. Though young, Edward III was not only a brilliant strategist, but also a visionary ruler who cared for the development of his nation's culture and traditions. Philippa of Hainault, the Queen of Compassion and the Arts. Philippa was born in Hainault, a region in present-day Belgium, and became queen when she married Edward III. She was not only a stable and intimate partner by royal standards of the time, but was also recognized as an outstanding regent when Edward was away leading military campaigns. Philippa was also renowned for her compassion. She organized and supported many charitable activities, helped the poor, and cared for war-wounded soldiers. In addition, she was a patron of the arts, promoting the development of court culture and artistic movements. A harmonious marriage and a large family. Edward and Philippa had a stable marriage, unlike many other royal households, and they had 12 children, a very large number for that era. Among their children, the most prominent were Edward the Black Prince, a legendary warrior, and Richard II, the future successor to the throne. Their royal family was not only a center of power, but also a symbol of unity, loyalty, and family ideals in a time of great societal turmoil. Court culture and the chivalric ideal. During the reign of Edward III and Philippa, the English court became famous for its elegance and the emphasis placed on chivalry. Edward III established the Order of the Garter, a prestigious institution symbolizing chivalric virtue and absolute loyalty to the king and the nation. The Order of the Garter was not just a military order, but a profound cultural element that forged a chivalric tradition passed down through the ages, the enduring influence of the reign of Edward III and Philippa. Their reign was a golden age of culture and politics, laying the foundation for England's long-term development. The combination of military strength, shrewd governance, and cultural advancement turned England into not only a power, but also a medieval center of art and culture. Tales of the royal household and palace life. No royal story is complete without tales from the royal household and palace, places of ceremony, feasting, and complex relationships. Under the reign of Edward and Philippa, the royal court was a gathering place for poets, artisans, and celebrated knights, creating an atmosphere vibrant with culture and brilliance. While the stories of Matilda and Eleanor help us understand the hardships of medieval royalty, the tale of Edward III and Philippa presents a different image, one of stability, development, and chivalric ideals. These two contrasting pieces come together to form a rich and multifaceted picture of medieval life, power, and culture. Through the story of Edward III and Philippa, we see that royalty was not only about power and war, but also a place where culture, art, and morality were nurtured and developed. After exploring the stories of prominent kings and queens like Edward III, Philippa, or Eleanor of Aquitaine, we now delve deeper into the broader picture of daily life and the heavy responsibilities borne by medieval monarchs. Behind the splendid thrones and supreme authority lay a world full of pressure, challenges, and unrelenting duties, the fragile balance between public duty and personal hardship. People often view monarchs as figures of absolute power, living lives of luxury without worry. But in reality, their lives were a constant balancing act between vast public responsibilities and personal struggles. A king might be handling political crises, negotiating strategic alliances, or arranging crucial marriages, all while facing family pressure, loneliness, or emotional wounds hidden from the public eye. Religion, an indispensable spiritual pillar. The lives of medieval monarchs were deeply entwined with religion. Each day, they spent many hours attending services, praying, and participating in religious rituals. This was not only a personal responsibility, but also a declaration of divine authority. The king was seen as God's representative on earth, making a close relationship with the church essential. Moments of prayer were also times when the king sought comfort and guidance in making difficult decisions. The education of princes and princesses, preparing for the future. From a very young age, princes and princesses received a rigorous education. They studied history, law, and the art of war, as well as courtly rituals, culture, and especially diplomatic skills. The primary goal of this education was to prepare them for political marriages that could determine the fate of the kingdom. Royal marriages, power transactions more than love. Unlike romantic tales, most royal marriages in the Middle Ages were arranged for political, economic, and military advantage. Marriage was seen as a means to forge alliances, consolidate power, and expand territory. Personal love was rarely valued and was even considered a luxury. Many kings and queens had to accept unhappy marriages, sometimes leading to internal conflicts and silent wars within the royal household. Castles, centers of power and life. Castles were not just residences for royalty, but also served as political, military, and cultural hubs of the kingdom. They hosted delegates, organized councils, prepared strategies, and even held lavish festivals and feasts. The architecture of castles was both highly defensive and a display of royal power and wealth. Thick stone walls, towering watchtowers, drawbridges, and fortified gates stood as testaments to the strength and resilience of the realm. Strict rituals and rules, every action under surveillance. Life in the castle and court was governed by a multitude of ceremonies, rules, and rigid traditions. From clothing and movement to greetings and even the smallest gestures, everything had to follow a strict protocol. Every action of royalty, officials, and even family members was closely monitored, as it could send political messages or affect reputation and power. Relentless pressure on the ruler. There was no room for negligence or mistakes. Every decision made by the monarch not only impacted their own fate, but also affected millions of people and the destiny of the entire kingdom. The ruler was constantly under the scrutiny of court factions, the nobility, the church, and the people. This pressure often forced kings and queens to live in loneliness, suffering, and sometimes led to grave errors in judgment. The story behind the throne, lesser-known aspects. Beneath the brocade robes and glittering crowns were individuals with deep personal concerns. The longing for family when separated from their children, moments of emotional vulnerability, and unavoidable conflicts and disagreements. It was also where stories of forgiveness, love, and loyalty were written, though seldom known. If the tales of Edward III, Eleanor of Aquitaine, or Queen Matilda show us the power and politics of the era, then the daily life of royalty offers a deeper understanding of the people behind the throne. They were not just symbols of power, but also individuals who endured, fought, and lived through countless trials and burdens. When we think of medieval kings and queens, the first images that come to mind are often those of boundless power, opulent splendor, and a seemingly dreamlike life. But behind the glittering crown, the splendid brocade garments tell another story. A story of burdens, loneliness, and silent tragedies only the royal family can truly understand. The crown, the golden cage, full of constraints. Power is the greatest gift, but also the heaviest burden a king can bear. The crown is often likened to a golden cage, dazzling and magnificent from the outside, but inside, a tight imprisonment with no escape. Every step the monarch takes is watched, every word and gesture carefully measured. Personal freedom becomes a luxury when every action carries political meaning, is scrutinized, and sometimes misunderstood. The threat of betrayal and war always looms. In the royal world, no one can be completely trusted. The risk of betrayal always exists from the closest people: officials, factional nobles, even family members. Power struggles are fought not only on battlefields, but also quietly within palace chambers, through whispers, arrangements, and conspiracies. This pressure forces kings to remain vigilant, living in a state of anxiety, suspicion, and profound loneliness. Family discord and personal tragedies. Beyond politics, the royal family is filled with tragic family stories. Conflicts, rebellions within the family, even imprisonment of royal members have happened more than once, fracturing familial bonds and leaving wounds not easily healed. Beneath the glory, complex relationships and personal conflicts are often hidden but become the root causes of many great historical events. Solemn rituals and inner struggles. Every formal ceremony, coronations, banquets, or audiences, is an intense pressure moment for the monarch. Though outwardly dignified and solemn, inwardly they may experience confusion, fear, and even a loneliness no one understands. These moments are complex inner battles between the image of power and deeply human emotions. Jewelry and decorations, symbols of power but also burdens. Heavy jeweled crowns, cloaks embroidered with shimmering gold thread, diamond-studded necklaces and rings are not just for show. They symbolize divine authority, affirming the king's status before subjects and enemies. Yet at the same time, such extravagance brings discomfort and heaviness, carried hour by hour, minute by minute. This material attachment also partly symbolizes the spiritual burden that kings had to bear. Opulence, a tool for impression and power consolidation. Luxury was not merely a matter of personal comfort, but a political strategy. Lavish banquets, elaborate garments, and grand ceremonies were designed to leave a lasting impression, to demonstrate authority, strength, and the enduring stability of the dynasty. They also served to affirm the monarch's unique position in a feudal society filled with competition and upheaval. Light and shadow in royal life. When we admire the brilliance of palaces and the splendor of royalty, we must not forget the accompanying shadows: loneliness, inner turmoil, personal losses. The life of a monarch was both glorious and tragic, a journey full of trials to maintain and expand their power. From Eleanor of Aquitaine with her stormy life, Matilda with her struggle for the throne, Edward III and Philip with their harmony and cultural growth, to now a broader portrait of the burden of power, all together compose a vivid symphony of living history. These stories not only deepen our understanding of history, but also offer profound lessons about humanity, power, and responsibility. Great power comes with great burden. Monarchs, despite their majestic appearance and authority, were still human, with emotions, worries, and unique challenges. They lived in a golden cage, a place illuminated by glorious light that also imprisoned them in duty, pressure, and solitude. Legacy and human empathy in medieval royal life, when power intertwines with humanity. After tales of authority, burdens, and the silent tragedies of medieval monarchs, let us now look deeper into another aspect: empathy, humaneness, and the legacy they left behind. Because even while standing at the pinnacle of power and status, they were still people, with emotions, challenges, and poignant stories capable of touching anyone's heart. Power does not erase humanity. We often think power and status create an invisible barrier between monarchs and ordinary people. But when we look closely at their daily lives, we realize they too experienced emotions like love, hatred, loneliness, confusion, and hope. They faced the pains of loss within the family, worries about succession, doubts in important decisions, and moments of vulnerability that could not be shared. Royal life, the blend of legend and reality. Many royal stories have been passed down as legends, with glorious victories, lavish weddings, and endless adventures. But beneath them lie very human realities: sacrifice, injustice, inner battles, and dreams left unfulfilled. This blend makes their stories both magnificent and intimate, inspiring admiration as well as deep empathy. Timeless themes: power, gender, faith, and family. The lives of kings and queens vividly demonstrate themes that never grow old: power and its consequences, injustice and gender biases, devotion to faith, and the central role of family in all decisions. In every era, these issues remain major questions humanity must face. Legacy beyond the throne and crown. The legacy left by monarchs is not only castles, victories, or long-lasting dynasties. They leave lessons of resilience, kindness, relentless struggle for justice, as well as stories of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. These help us see them not merely as symbols of power, but as complex, emotional human beings. Empathy across history. When we imagine medieval royal life, we do not only see distant images, but also our own shadows, worries, joys, hopes, and dreams. This makes history vivid and close, allowing us to feel a connection across time between past and present. Royal stories. A mirror for life today. The tales of kings and queens are not just history to learn from, but also mirrors reflecting how we face challenges, pressures, and responsibilities in modern life. They teach us persistence, understanding, and the ability to balance power with emotion. After exploring together the lives, burdens, and legacies of medieval kings, queens, and emperors, I now want to share with you intriguing, dramatic anecdotes, vibrant colors forming the full picture of royalty in those times. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Crusade of a Shackled Heart. If history is a harsh chronicle, Eleanor of Aquitaine is one of its brightest pages, yet also the most erased and rewritten. Born not to be silent, Eleanor threw herself into politics, war, and love, with all the sharpness and defiance of a woman unwilling to remain a shadow behind the throne. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine, a land wealthier and more vast than the king's own domain. She was queen of two empires, France and England. She was the mother of great kings, Richard the Lionheart and John the Untrustworthy. But before all of that, Eleanor was the woman in steel-tipped boots, riding across the Middle Eastern desert, leading an army on a crusade, a place few women dared to tread. The early years, not meant for mediocrity. Eleanor was born in 1122 into one of the most powerful, noble families in the West. When her father died, Eleanor, only 15 years old, inherited the entire domain of Aquitaine. Not only an heiress, she became a symbol of intelligence, beauty, and authority that made kings turn their heads. Louis VII, King of France, married her not merely for love, but because he knew that marrying Eleanor meant marrying an entire kingdom. They wed in 1137, but from the beginning, the marriage was a quiet collision between two incompatible souls. Louis was a devout man, so religious he had once intended to become a monk. Eleanor, by contrast, belonged to the world. Fiery, clever, freedom-loving, and unafraid to look men in the eye. She adored poetry, hunting, and engaging in political debate. To Eleanor, the throne was not a place for silence. It was a place to speak and to fight. The Second Crusade, when the Queen rode to war. In 1145, Pope Eugenius III called for a new crusade to reclaim Edessa, a fallen Holy Land seized by Muslim forces. Louis VII, eager to atone for a past sin, having burned hundreds alive at Vitry, joined at once. And Eleanor, unlike any queen before her, chose to accompany him. But she did not go as a mere follower. Eleanor brought with her a retinue of hundreds of Aquitanian knights, loyal to her alone. She wore armor, rode on horseback, gave orders, and according to some accounts, even commanded troops when Louis lost direction. It is said she inspired the soldiers with ancient songs, pitched her tent close to the front lines, and held the morale of her men with regal strength. It was something unheard of, a queen, the highest woman in the realm, not standing behind the battle, but in its midst. Rumors and the unraveling of a marriage. But light never lasts long in the palace, especially not in times of war. As the crusade descended into chaos, Louis lost control and failure followed failure. Someone had to take the blame. And Eleanor, too strong, too visible, too different, became the perfect target. Rumors began to spread that she was romantically involved with Raymond of Poitiers, her cousin and the Prince of Antioch. Raymond was charming, intelligent, and shared with Eleanor a deep passion for military strategy, languages, and politics. They often held private meetings in tents, drafting plans together rather than following Louis, a man clearly lacking in tactical skill. No one knows what really happened between Eleanor and Raymond. It could have been strategy, it could have been sympathy, or it could have been something no one can prove. But neither could anyone deny it. History is not written by truth, but by what is believed to be true. And when King Louis heard those rumors, jealousy combined with the shame of military defeat struck a heavy blow to a marriage that was already fragile. Louis forced Eleanor to leave Antioch despite her objections. She was compelled to return to France in bitterness, and afterward, she demanded a divorce. Divorce and the beginning of a new dynasty. The divorce in 1152 was an unprecedented scandal, not only because Eleanor was a queen, but because she was the one who initiated it. She reclaimed the territory of Aquitaine, and just a few weeks later married Henry Plantagenet, who would later become King Henry II of England. A man nearly a decade younger than her, but full of ambition and charisma. If the first marriage was a political arrangement, the second was an explosion of passion and strategy. Henry and Eleanor, both intelligent, tough, and decisive, built the Plantagenet Empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. They had 8 children together, including Richard and John, 2 kings who would leave a deep mark on English history. But no dynasty comes without its shadows. Imprisonment, 16 years in silence. After a passionate beginning, the relationship between Eleanor and Henry began to deteriorate, not only because Henry had many mistresses, most notably Rosamund Clifford, but because he increasingly resented Eleanor's political involvement. When their sons, especially Richard and young Henry, rebelled against their father, Eleanor was accused of incitement and betrayal. Henry II did not kill her, something many other kings would have done. But he did something more cruel. He imprisoned her for 16 years. No specific prison was recorded. She was moved from one castle to another under strict surveillance, barred from court affairs, forbidden from seeing her children, like a ghost of her former self. During that time, she wrote letters, maintained secret contact with Richard, and quietly wove the threads of her return. Resurgence, from chains to regency. In 1189, when Henry II died, Richard ascended the throne. The first thing he did was free his mother. Eleanor, now nearly 70 years old, emerged from the shadows. Not frail, not bitter, but full of resolve. She became regent when Richard went to fight in another crusade. In her final years, Eleanor journeyed thousands of miles to defend the rights of her descendants, negotiating with the Pope, mediating conflicts among princes. She was no longer young, but still sharp, still the kind of woman no court dared to underestimate. She died in 1204 at over 80 years old, a rare longevity in that era. Yet more remarkable than her age was this. Even in death, Eleanor remained controversial. Some hailed her as the first symbol of Western feminism. Others criticized her as cunning, ambitious, even wanton. But no one could deny she was a figure impossible to forget. History often reserves silence for women, but Eleanor, through her choices and her mistakes, forced history to speak. She was not a perfect icon. She may have betrayed, hungered for power, acted outside the moral codes of her time, and that is precisely what made her human, vivid, complex, impossible to reduce to a single mold. Her crusade was not merely a march to the Holy Land, but a journey to prove that a woman could wield power, could fail, could love, could hate, and still remain herself. And if we listen closely within the quiet pages of history, we still hear the echo of a queen's horse, armor clinking, leading her own army toward freedom, even if the cost was a lifetime of being misunderstood. If Eleanor of Aquitaine was the blazing fire of politics and passion, then Matilda, the woman who came a century before, was the slow-burning flame that endured through England's coldest years. In a world where the throne was a man's game and women who refused to be pawns were cast as monsters, Matilda chose a third path, to be a survivor. Not by beauty, not by submission, but by intellect, resilience, and, on one fateful snowy night, by a coffin. The royal daughter, and a vow never truly kept. Matilda was the only surviving daughter of King Henry I of England. After the sudden death of her brother in the White Ship disaster, King Henry had no choice but to name Matilda, the only one left, as his heir. An unprecedented move, because Matilda was a woman. And to the English nobility of the 12th century, a woman on the throne was an insult to the sacred order of men. Even so, in 1127, the nobles were forced to swear allegiance to Matilda as successor. But oaths, as history has shown many times, are fragile when faced with ambition. When King Henry I died, his nephew, Stephen of Blois, seized the throne, swiftly, cleanly, effectively. Only one problem: Matilda was still alive, and she had not forgotten that vow. A civil war broke out, lasting nearly 20 years. It became known as the Anarchy, when no one truly knew who the rightful king was. In that war, Matilda was not just a symbol. She was a warrior, a strategist, a woman who dared to reclaim what was hers through blood and iron. The Siege of Oxford, snow in a coffin. Winter of 1142. The city of Oxford lay buried in white snow. The castle where Matilda was taking refuge was tightly besieged by King Stephen's forces. The situation was desperate. No reinforcements, no escape. Just a few more days and it would all be over. And if captured, Matilda knew, she would not only be stripped of her title, but could lose her life. But Matilda did not wait to die, nor did she wait to be rescued. She, once again, chose a different path. A bold plan was drawn in silence. On the darkest night, when snow thickened over the ground, Matilda, dressed in white, cloaked herself in white, and silently slipped out of the castle like a shadow melting into the night. Some accounts say she was lowered from the fortress in a wooden coffin, so the guards would think it was a corpse and no one checked. Other versions say she slid down the icy castle wall and crossed the frozen river Thames, silent as a ghost. Whichever version is true, one thing is undeniable. Matilda escaped. She, a royal woman, fled a military siege by herself in deadly winter conditions. No carriage, no entourage, no divine protection. Only willpower, courage, and steady feet carrying her through the winter night. By the next morning, when Stephen's soldiers realized she was gone, it was too late. The woman in the coffin had survived, once again. No crown, but not defeated. The irony is, Matilda never truly became a reigning queen in the formal sense. As the Civil War dragged on and England was engulfed in chaos, she was forced to retreat to Normandy. But that failure, if we look closely, was a setback that laid the groundwork for lasting triumph. She never wore the crown. But her son, Henry, became king. In 1154, when Stephen died, Matilda's son ascended the throne as King Henry II of England, the very man who would later marry Eleanor of Aquitaine. A new generation took the throne, but it could never have happened without Matilda's bravery. She paved the way, through endurance, escapes, and strategic thinking, through planting in her son a steely will and a pragmatic view of power. And so Matilda, who never wore the crown, became the founding matriarch of a glorious dynasty, the House of Plantagenet. The surviving letters and the portrait of a forgotten woman on it. Very few of Matilda's words have survived time. But in the letters she wrote to popes, lords, and even enemies, we see the portrait of a woman who never stopped fighting, never stopped defending her honor, not just for herself, but for the very idea that a woman could rule. She did not write as a victim. She did not ask for pity. She wrote as a ruler, demanding justice, invoking law, and ready to wage war with words. There was a time when Matilda wrote, "I do not demand mercy, I demand the oath that was betrayed." A woman demanding the return of an oath in an era where oaths belonged to men. Matilda and Eleanor, 2 chapters, 1 book. When we look back at Eleanor of Aquitaine, the woman who dared to ride into battle, to love, to scheme, to be imprisoned, we suddenly realize that image stands not alone. For nearly a century before Eleanor, Matilda had already written the opening chapter of that story, that women and power were not mere myths. They never knew each other, but they were bound by a silent current running through history, the quiet resistance of royal women against a fate already written. They did not break the rules, but they bent them enough to survive. They did not wield swords, but each step, each choice, was its own battlefield. If Eleanor was doubted for a rumored affair, imprisoned for political ambition, then Matilda was denied entirely by a system because of her gender. And when both refused silence, history, long written by men, was forced to add chapters it could no longer ignore. Legacy, not in crowns, but in blood and intellect. Matilda has no grand statue, no radiant shrine. In schoolbook history, she is often mentioned only as the mother of Henry II. But the truth is, she laid the foundation for the entire Plantagenet dynasty, a dynasty that would guide England for centuries, usher in the rule of law, and leave an indelible mark on European history. She did not win through armies, but through endurance. She did not seize the throne with power, but with persistence and wisdom. And in an era when women were seen as weak, cunning, or destined only to pray in chapels, Matilda stepped out of the castle, not to flee, but to keep fighting. no one remembers what kind of wood that coffin was made of. No one is sure whether it was legend or truth, but in the memory of history, that image, a woman lying in a coffin, silent yet unyielding, has become an immortal symbol. In the stormy annals of royal dynasties, we often remember the men, generals, conquerors, empire builders with swords and armies. But there were also women who wore no armor, held no blade, yet shifted the fate of entire nations, not through blood, but through compassion. Philippa of Hainault was one such woman, not roaring on the battlefield like Eleanor, not escaping in a coffin like Matilda. Philippa stood silent between the throne and the people, and became an indispensable part of medieval England, not through triumphs, but through compassion. Philippa arrived in England in 1328, when she was only 14 years old. She was the daughter of the Count of Hainault, a region now part of Belgium, and was married to Prince Edward, the future King Edward III. This marriage was a strategic alliance, arranged by her mother-in-law, Isabella of France, the powerful woman who had overthrown King Edward II. But Philippa, unlike the pawns of political games, did not accept being just another name in the royal lineage. Despite her youth, she quickly adapted to court life and became a capable companion to Edward, a young king full of ambition but also exposed to great risks. Philippa is often described as gentle, virtuous, and soft-spoken. But behind that quietness was rare intelligence and courage, and she would prove it not with words, but with action, at a moment when the kingdom needed someone to stand firm. When Edward III left England to lead military campaigns in France during the Hundred Years' War, Philippa was entrusted with the role of regent, a position traditionally held by men, now placed in the hands of a young foreign woman. And she did not disappoint. During Edward's absence, Philippa kept the kingdom stable and managed court affairs with skill. She did not interfere harshly, nor did she wield power like an usurper. Instead, she used patience, subtlety, and compassion to ease conflicts and maintain the people's faith in royal authority. In council meetings, she listened more than she commanded, but every decision she made was followed, not out of fear, but out of respect. Historians describe Philippa as someone who knew exactly when to be gentle and when to be firm. She was not a king, but ruled like a true queen. In 1347, Edward III secured a major victory in the war against France. The port city of Calais, a vital stronghold on the English Channel, surrendered after months of siege. To deter other cities, Edward ordered the execution of 6 of Calais' most prominent citizens. They were forced to walk barefoot, dressed in white shirts, carrying the keys to the city, with nooses around their necks, symbols of surrender and impending death. As these men knelt before Edward, the scaffolds were already in place. It was a defining moment. The King of England sought to show all of Europe that none who opposed him would escape punishment. Then Philippa stepped forward. At that moment, she was pregnant. She knelt before her husband in front of courtiers and generals and said, "My lord, if I have ever done anything to please you, then today, I beg you, grant mercy for my sake to these men. They have suffered enough. Mercy, my lord, will bring more glory to your name than this victory ever could." It was an almost unimaginable moment for that era. A wife, with no military rank, no sovereign crown, daring to intervene in a king's decision, and doing so with tears. Edward III, who had commanded dozens of bloody battles, fell silent, and he spared the lives of those 6 men. Calais became a symbol not only of war, but of compassion, because a woman had dared to plead in the coldest heart of power. Philippa was not just a kind queen, she was a strategist. Throughout her life, she followed military campaigns closely, advised her husband when necessary, and was especially skilled at settling internal disputes. She founded one of the first royal hospitals for the wounded. She subsidized monasteries, aided the poor, and organized vocational programs for women. She consistently demanded that soldiers treat prisoners humanely, a rare stance in a time when brutality was the norm. Records tell of how, during an outbreak of plague, she personally visited the sick camps, brought medicine, and wiped the brows of the dying, regardless of their status. The people loved her so deeply that they called her the Mother of the Kingdom. With her children, she was firm yet gentle. Under her guidance, they were taught not only the art of war, but how to rule with heart. Philippa died in 1369 after more than 40 years as queen. Her death marked the end of one of the most stable and prosperous periods in Edward III's reign. Edward, a celebrated warrior, had never shown sorrow on the battlefield, but Philippa's death broke him. He never remarried. For the rest of his life, he lived quietly, almost in isolation. He had her tomb built at Westminster, inscribed with the words, "Here lies Philippa, my friend, my companion, my beloved wife, to whom I am forever grateful." No need for conquests, no need for monuments. Philippa's greatest legacy was the gentleness she sowed in the harshest years of English history. If Eleanor was a burning flame, and Matilda the smoke that crept through every wall, then Philippa was the cool spring that soothed fields scorched by war. The three women, from century to century, proved that a queen is not merely the figure behind the throne. They could be the ones riding into battle, escaping a siege, or pleading for an enemy's life. Regardless of their role, they share one common trait: refusing to be silenced. And that is the deep essence of true power. No need to shout to be heard. European royal history, if viewed only through thrones and ceremonial robes, might lead us to think it is a realm of order and grandeur. But in reality, behind thick stone walls, in great halls draped with velvet and perfumed with expensive scents, there is always room for tragedy, sometimes sparked by the smallest things: a candle, a spark, or a reckless game. And at the French court in the late 14th century, it was exactly such small things that turned a ball into a catastrophe, shaking the entire kingdom. That was the Night of the Burning Men. The ball was held at the Saint-Paul Palace in Paris. The occasion was the wedding of one of Queen Isabeau of Bavaria's close attendants. But everyone knew that partying at the French court under King Charles VI was never just a celebration. It was a display of power, status, and luxury, a stage where royals and nobles competed in performances clad in gilded costumes and drunk on wine. King Charles VI was just over 30 then, a young, handsome king called Charles the Beloved by his subjects, but also a man whose mind had begun quietly to fracture. Delusions, brief bouts of madness, hallucinations, they came and went like cold winds through the castle. Yet, in his moments of clarity, Charles remained the center of every feast. That night, to entertain the guests, the king and a group of nobles decided to perform a spectacle called the Wild Boar's Arrows, a dance mimicking wild forest creatures, like wearing bizarre costumes, masks, and bodies covered with flax fibers soaked in resin, highly flammable like tinder. And that was when tragedy began to brew. In the Great Hall, amid echoing music and the warm yellow glow of hundreds of candles, 6 men, including King Charles, appeared in half-human, half-beast guise. They danced, howled, playing wild creatures from the deep forest. Laughter filled the air. The queen also laughed, unaware she sat among a pile of live straw. No one sensed the imminent danger. Suddenly, a piercing scream. A torch in the hand of Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, was swung too close to one of the dancers. The flame caught the flax, then flared fiercely like a beast unleashed from its cage. In a matter of seconds, the entire room turned into hell. The men in flammable costumes began screaming, trying to roll on the ground, tearing off their masks, but the flames had already devoured their skin and flesh. Panic spread faster than the fire itself. People trampled over each other in a frantic escape. Nobles shouted, handmaidens fell, and at the center of the chaos, King Charles stood motionless, eyes wide open, unsure whether what he saw was theater or reality. His mental illness had distorted every sense. One of the ladies-in-waiting, reportedly Princess Jeanne de Boulogne, acted swiftly. She covered the king with her long gown, smothered the flames, and pulled him out of the fire. He survived. The other 5 men were not so fortunate. They were burned alive before the eyes of the entire royal court. Their charred bodies were later carried out of the Great Hall in silence, scorched skin, the stench of burnt hair, and the fading trace of human life dissolving into the cold night. The death of the 5 nobles was not merely a personal tragedy. It sent shockwaves through the royal family. First came the issue of credibility. A king who partook in such a dangerous game like a child and nearly burned alive in his own palace, it made people begin to question Charles's capacity to rule. Rumors of the king's madness, which had circulated for some time, now became more evident than ever. Then, simmering tensions between court factions erupted. Louis of Orleans, who had accidentally dropped the torch, was blamed. Despite being the king's brother, he was seen as foolish and dangerous. Families who had lost loved ones began quietly withdrawing from the royal circle, seeking new alliances. Queen Isabeau, who witnessed the entire tragedy, never smiled at court festivities again. After that fateful masquerade, Charles VI's mind continued to deteriorate. His psychotic episodes worsened. He failed to recognize relatives, believed he was made of glass, screamed in the night claiming he was being murdered, and sometimes fled the palace without clothing. He had to be kept in rooms draped with thick fabrics, shielded from all light. The physicians of the time, utterly lacking in neurological understanding, could only pray and place herbs upon the king's forehead. The court fell into a state of powerlessness. The king was alive but unable to rule. Queen Isabeau began acting on the king's behalf to manage the affairs of the court, continuously accused by factions of manipulating power. The ball of the burning men, from a harmless game, ignited the fragile stability of the French royal family. The event was called by the strange name Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. No one remembers the names of the 5 unfortunate nobles. They remain only shadows, bodies burned, in a story told as a warning. When power plays with fate, fire distinguishes neither king nor commoner. More than a century later, France would again fall into war and chaos. But for those who study history, that ball was seen as an omen, showing cracks had begun from within. In previous chapters, we recounted Eleanor of Aquitaine, the woman who dared to go on crusade, Matilda, who escaped in a coffin to save her life, Philippa, who saved an entire city with tears. But this time, no woman could save everything. Isabeau of Bavaria, queen to Charles VI, did her utmost to preserve the court. But facing that fire, she was powerless. Like many women in the madness of powerful men, she could only watch. She could not scream, could not change anything, only grit her teeth and endure. And so the fire burned for many years after, no longer the flame of candles or torches, but the fire of the people's anger, of war, of slow collapse. Because what burned that night was not only linen, flesh, or honor, but the faith in the inviolability of the throne. And from the ashes, history reminds us, what destroys a dynasty sometimes begins with a very small flame. Westminster, 1303. When the throne was stolen in the night, if the fires once burned faith at the French court in the Ball of the Burning Men, then in England, just half a century earlier, another story, without fire, without blood, had shaken the throne silently. In 1303, in the heart of London, the seat of English royal power, Westminster Palace, witnessed one of the most daring thefts in history. The thief took not only gold and jewels. He took what every monarchy wants to hide, the royal family's helplessness before a stealthy hand. Westminster was not only the residence of kings, it was a symbol, a fortress of law, religion, and unified sovereignty. The coronation ceremony, solemn council meetings, treaties signed under flickering candlelight in the Great Hall, all sent a message: the throne is inviolable. But then, on a moonless night, within thick stone walls and under the watch of guards clad in gleaming armor, someone entered, not with a sword, but in silence. And in that silence, the history of England was thrown into disarray. When the theft was discovered in early May of 1303, all of London was shaken. The royal treasury, where the crown, ceremonial swords, relics, and the very symbols of sovereignty were kept, had been ransacked. Over 100 precious items were stolen, many of which appeared only during coronations. But what shocked the royal court even more was that the mastermind wasn't a bandit from the outskirts, nor a foreign saboteur, but a monk who lived within Westminster Abbey itself. His name was Richard of Pudlacott. Once a weaver, then a monk, then a thief. Some said he was a victim of circumstance, impoverished, expelled from his religious order, surviving off the pity of other clerics. But others believed he was a criminal genius, a man who patiently observed every weakness, memorized every shift change, and knew the hidden passageways of the ancient abbey. He didn't act alone. Richard conspired with outsiders, blacksmiths, guards, even some bribed insiders within the abbey itself. They devised a bold plan to infiltrate the royal treasury located directly beneath Westminster Hall, a site believed to be under constant and impenetrable guard. But precisely because it was considered untouchable, no one thought anyone would dare to strike. On the night of the robbery, everything was suspiciously normal. Guards changed shifts, monks prayed, there were no screams, No bloodshed, just a door unlatched, a tunnel opened, and a group of people disappearing into the night with large sacks. By the following morning, no one suspected anything. It wasn't until weeks later, when the court was preparing for a major ceremony and sent officials to inventory the treasures, that the truth was uncovered. The lids of treasure chests had been pried open. Ornate boxes lay empty. The ceremonial sword had vanished. The jewels once set in the crown left only scratches behind. A theft committed in the very heart of the monarchy, with no noise and no casualties, but leaving a stain that could not be erased. When word reached King Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, he was leading a campaign in the north. A hard, disciplined monarch who believed in order and authority, Edward now had to face a terrifying reality. Even his palace was no longer secure. Edward was so furious he canceled all military operations for several weeks to focus solely on the investigation. A massive manhunt was launched across London, especially around Westminster. Monks were interrogated, guards were tortured, arrest warrants flew like arrows in a storm. Richard of Pudlicot was captured not long after, and according to his testimony, many others were dragged into legal trouble. Some historians say that more than 20 people were interrogated, imprisoned, and executed in connection with the case. But what angered Edward the most was not the loss of gold and silver. It was the shame. How could an empire that had conquered Wales, defeated Scottish rebels, and signed numerous international treaties fail to protect its own treasure beneath the palace? After the theft, Westminster Palace was reinforced. The royal treasure was temporarily relocated to the Tower of London, a place with tighter security. Entrances were renovated, underground corridors were sealed, guards were doubled, and, more importantly, a new message was sent. The throne is not protected by stone walls, but by reverence and fear. For many years afterward, Edward's successors remained haunted by the incident. Ceremonies became more solemn, regalia were remade not merely as replacements, but to reaffirm that royal authority remained intact. Yet among the people, the story of the Westminster theft became a strange legend, a symbol that even places deemed untouchable could be breached if someone dared. It is said that Queen Margaret of France, wife of King Edward I, quietly visited her private chapel upon hearing the news. She did not cry, did not speak, but for the rest of her life, she never again wore the pearl rosary, one of the stolen treasures that was never recovered. Some losses require no mourning, because what was stolen was not just material, it was the belief in one's own inviolability. From Eleanor, imprisoned for her power, to Matilda, who hid in a coffin to preserve her life, then Philippa, who begged for a city with her tears. Now the story took a new form, an intrusion from the outside into the heart of royalty. No longer the woman who rebels, but the woman who must witness and endure. Queen Margaret, though absent from the battlefield, became a silent witness to a quiet collapse, not by war, not by rebellion, but by a hand that dared to touch what was most sacred, the chest holding the symbols of power. And Westminster, the heart of the monarchy, no matter how much it is rebuilt, reinforced, or adorned in gold, will forever carry a scar. It is the memory of a night no one heard, but everyone remembers. A night when the crown was stolen and the throne for the first time felt cold. In the history of European royalty, marriages often did not begin with love. They were crafted by advisors, treaties, and entangled political interests, and often they ended in betrayal, imprisonment, or cold deaths by the blade of the law. Yet among the many unions filled with schemes, there was one rare exception, where two people, born from two different worlds, not only stayed together for life, but ruled a magnificent dynasty side by side, Edward III and Philippa of Hainault. It would not be an exaggeration to say they were the golden couple of English royalty, not because they were perfect, but because through war, plague, and political chaos, they never let go of each other. In 1326, England plunged into crisis. King Edward II was deposed by his own wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover Roger Mortimer. His son, Prince Edward, only 14 years old, was placed on the throne as a symbol of reconciliation. At a time when the crown was still fragile, Isabella hastily sought a foreign bride, one who could bring a military alliance and yet be easy to control. The chosen one was Philippa of Hainault, a young princess from a distant land, what is now Belgium. Philippa was only 13 at the time. She was described as not remarkable in beauty, but with gentle eyes and deep intelligence. Edward, upon meeting her, may not have been smitten, but he was likely intrigued. Their wedding took place in 1328. It was neither grand nor romantic, but fate had skillfully chosen the right two, not to love each other at once, but to learn how to love each other, day by day. When Edward III officially took power, the kingdom was still fractured. His father had been murdered, his mother suspected of manipulating the court, and he himself was just a teenager emerging from the shadow of adults. Yet beside him, from the earliest days of his reign, stood Philippa. She was not just a queen in the background. She was a recorder, an advisor, a listener, reviewing reports with him, offering counsel during political debates. And when Edward launched his ambitious military campaigns to restore England's reputation in France, Philippa volunteered to stay behind as regent. And as you've already seen from earlier accounts, she did so no less capably than any king. In nearly 40 years together, Edward and Philippa had 14 children, many of whom became pillars of history. Edward the Black Prince, the legendary warrior of the 100 Years' War, John of Gaunt, the foundation of the Lancaster line, and Edmund of Langley, forefather of the York House. They didn't just bear children, they raised them. Edward didn't see child rearing as solely the queen's duty. He spent time with his sons, trained them in military arts, taught them court etiquette, and proudly took part in family ceremonies. Philippa, in turn, taught their daughters art, religion, and compassion. She always emphasized, an heir to the throne must know how to wield a sword and how to listen. And Edward agreed. They held many celebrations. But unlike the decadent spectacles of the French court, such as the infamous Ball of the Burning Men mentioned earlier, the court of Edward III and Philippa was filled with chivalric tradition, tournaments, knighting ceremonies, charitable festivals, open to commoners. Philippa was always present alongside Edward at important events. It is said that, unlike most royal couples who avoided displays of affection in public, Edward often held his wife's hand before the crowd and did not hesitate to call her "my most loyal friend." When she was pregnant, Edward personally ordered additional chambers to be built, arranged for personal attendance, and organized prayers at the royal chapel for each safe delivery. Such care, in the Middle Ages, was rare and deeply meaningful. Philippa passed away in 1369 after nearly 42 years of marriage. It is said that when Edward learned she was dying, he set aside all affairs of state to be with her. He sat by her bed, holding her hand until the very end. No court, no ceremony, just two people, as they had always been, walking through time together. After Philippa's death, Edward changed noticeably. He never remarried, rarely appeared in public, and gradually passed power to his son. In his final years, he lived quietly, filled with longing, and, according to records, often sat alone in the room where her portrait hung. He died in 1377 and was buried beside Philippa, just as he had wished. In a world where royal marriages often collapsed under the weight of power, betrayal, and politics, the life of Edward III and Philippa stands as proof of another kind of love, quiet, steadfast, and needing no grand display. They did not have to flee like the couples of Matilda's time. They did not have to fight for a throne as in the days of Eleanor. They did not have to beg for mercy like Philippa once did in Calais. They only had to stay, keep their vows, and walk together through the long, cold, political winters. If love were a crown, they had already given it to each other, not in ceremony, but in everyday lived with truth. Edward and Philippa did not leave behind earth-shaking love letters, but they left behind a dynasty not undone by rebellion from within their own hearts. And in the chronicles, among pages filled with war, treaties, and executions, there still remains one quiet line. They were husband and wife, companions, two souls who looked in the same direction and never turned away. And so as we close this journey through the lives of Matilda, Eleanor, and Philippa, women who dared to step beyond the confines of their time were left with a quiet awe. Their strength wasn't always loud, their victories weren't always crowned, but their legacies echo through the centuries. How do you feel after hearing their stories? Did something resonate with you? A moment? A decision? A defiance? If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And before you drift off to sleep, send a few kind goodnight wishes in the comments. Someone out there might need them more than you know. Sleep well, dear listener.